Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rosalind Walker, Curator Emerita of the Arts of Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific, and the Margaret McDermott Curator of African Art. I'm happy to still be here, and I'm very happy to see you guys today. The first really nice day after all this weather, so thanks for being here. You're in for a very special treat and opportunity to look and learn and be totally thrilled. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kristen Windmuller Luna, who is going to educate you today in the most charming way. 3 centuries after the pharaohs of ancient Egypt ended their reigns, new African rulers built empires in the northern and eastern regions of Africa. Spanning from the empires of Aksum and later Empire of Ethiopia, comprised of present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, to the Christian kingdoms of Nubia in present-day Sudan, these complex civilizations cultivated economic, political, and cultural relationships with one another. The Byzantine Empire, or Byzantium, which was inheritor of the Roman Empire, also took part in these artistic and cultural networks as it briefly expanded its footprint into northern Africa, including Egypt, which you know is over there in the northeast corner. Today, these great civilizations created their own unique arts while also building a shared visual culture across the regions linked by the Mediterranean and Red Seas, the Nile River, and the Sahara Desert. From antiquity through the early modern era, about 200 to 1800 Christian era, communities in these regions shared the experience of becoming Christian. This period's arts reflect a constant evolution as multivocal sects, councils, and individuals shaped Orthodox Christian faiths. While past art historians, historical studies, have incorrectly described Nubian and especially Ethiopian arts as derivative of Byzantine arts, this presentation foregrounds African agency and creativity by recounting how African artists chose, rejected, or adapted elements of foreign art while also making their own artistic innovations. Dr. Kristen Windmuller Luna is a curator of African arts at the Cleveland Museum of Art. A first-generation college graduate from Yale University, she received her MA and PhD in African art and architecture from Princeton University. With over 17 years of experience in museums, she has previously held positions at public and private institutions, including the Brooklyn Museum, the Princeton University Art Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In addition to her curatorial roles, she has also worked as a museum educator and a university lecturer. Her recent exhibitions include Threads Across Time, African Textiles, from 500 to 1993, in Stories from Storage, that was in 2021, and at the Cleveland Museum of Arts, and the African Arts Global Conversations in 2021, which is special to me, Igongong 2019 at the Brooklyn Museum. I have to tell you a little bit about this. The Brooklyn Museum of Art collection has a very nice Yoruba collection, but an Igongong masquerade costume that's a cousin to the one on view in our gallery. The one at the Brooklyn Museum comes from a Boma show, a town in Nigeria. And it was a Yoruba artist that created this costume The Gungun masquerade brings the ancestors back to town every year. And 1,000 years ago when I did field work, that's what I went to study. And went as far as an outsider and a woman could go. There's more to that story, but we don't have time for that today. But it would amuse you. Anyway, she did research on this masquerade costume and was able to trace it all the way back to the family that owned it and the family that made it, because you had artists and craftspeople working on objects like this. And it's formidable. I mean, it's not easy to do. Not easy at all, so, proud of you, proud of you. And yesterday we spent a lot of time examining our costumes, so that was fun. We're having a good time in storage. Co-organized by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Cleveland Museum of Art, her current exhibition is Africa and Byzantium, which is on view at the Cleveland Museum of Art through July 21st. Expansive and inclusive new ways of collaborating, collecting, and curating are central to Dr. Windmiller Luna's museum practice, as well as mentoring up-and-coming professionals. She serves on the boards of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association and the journal African Arts. Her research on historical and contemporary African arts has been published both here and abroad, in America, in Africa, and in Europe. And these include Res, Anthropology and Aesthetics, African Arts, which is our professional journal, NCA, Journal of Contemporary African Art, and the Metropolitan Museum Journal. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Windmiller Luna, who will consider becoming Christian together, the arts of Ethiopia, Nubia, and Byzantium, through the Cleveland Museum of Art's unique presentation of Africa and Byzantium, as well as through key works in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art. Please welcome our speaker. And there goes the phone. Just leave it. We'll get it later.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and Dr. Roslyn, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It has been such a joy to get to spend time together and to have fun in storage and share stories, and I'm really delighted to be with all of you this afternoon. And my thanks as well to Christina Echezarreta for inviting me to be here at Dallas with all of you for this year's Boshell Family Lecture on Archaeology. While it may be tempting to think that global connectivity has only occurred now, people linked by the Nile River, the Sahara Desert, and the Mediterranean Sea were well connected centuries ago. In the 500s, the Greek traveler Cosmas Indicopleustes journeyed to the Empire of Aksum in Eastern Africa. Impressed by his account, a scribe added an illumination of Aksum to a copy of that text 500 years later. The monks of the holy monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai have cared for that volume ever since. In the 15th century, the Ethiopian emperor Zar-Yaakub noted that emissaries from Rome, Greece, and Constantinople were in his realm, and that Ethiopia sent them emissaries in return. Perhaps this Byzantine cross, found in Ethiopia and now here in Dallas, came through such diplomacy. In the early 1500s, Ethiopia's Emperor Lebna-Dengel sent monks to Crete to buy him icons. While Cretan and Ethiopian orthodoxies are different, Ethiopians found Cretan paintings of the Virgin Mary and Christ to be both religiously and aesthetically acceptable. Maybe it was one of these Cretan images that was joined with an Ethiopian painting of St. George to create a single devotional painting in the 1500s. People and ideas traveled in this connected world. Images of the 13th century Ethiopian saint Tekle Haymanot are still found across the Christian world, such as in this Coptic Orthodox church in Cairo, Egypt. Both secular and sacred art connected people across faith, place, and time. Yet, artistic transfer was not about cultural domination. It was a dialogue, as artists made imported arts acceptable to them in terms of faith, style, and culture. 3 centuries after the pharaohs of ancient Egypt ended their role, new African rulers built empires in the northern and eastern regions of that continent. Spanning from the empires of Aksum and the later Empire of Ethiopia in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, to the Christian kingdoms of Nubia in present-day Sudan, these complex civilizations cultivated economic, political, and cultural relationships with one another. The Byzantine Empire, or Byzantium, which was inheritor of the Roman Empire, also took part in these artistic and cultural networks as it briefly expanded its footprint into northern Africa, including Egypt. Together, these great civilizations created their own unique arts while also building a shared visual culture across the regions linked by the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River, and Sahara Desert. From late antiquity through the early modern era, about 200 to 1800 Common Era, or CE, communities in these regions shared the experience of becoming Christian. This period's art reflects the constant evolution as multivocal sects, councils, and individuals shaped Orthodox Christian faiths. While past art historical studies have incorrectly described Nubian, and especially Ethiopian Christian arts as supposedly derivative of Byzantine arts, my lecture today foregrounds African agency and creativity by recounting how African artists chose, rejected, or adapted elements of foreign art while also making their own artistic innovations. I'll consider that topic through artworks in the Cleveland Museum of Art's presentation of the special exhibition Africa and Byzantium, as well as with objects here in the collection at the DMA. At the Cleveland Museum of Art through July 21, Africa and Byzantium presents Northern and Eastern African kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire as equal players on the same field. Allies and rivals and communities becoming Christian together. People of different faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and local religions, living alongside and learning from one another. Artists working with both global references and local aesthetics in mind. Co-organized by the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Africa and Byzantium is the first international loan show to treat this topic. In our uniquely Cleveland presentation of the exhibition, we take an Africa-centered position, drawing from our near century of exhibitions celebrating African cultures. The exhibition covers a vast span of time and geography, with cultures and arts that lasted long after political entities ended. The maps here cycle through cycle through the years 200 through 1800, approximately the scope of the exhibition. Here, the Byzantine Empire is noted in purple, the Nubian kingdoms in yellow, the empires of Aksum and later Ethiopia in blue, and Muslim polities are in green. These maps emphasize how Nubia, Aksum, and Ethiopia were always independent from the Byzantine Empire. These maps also make plain the short duration of the Byzantine Empire on the African continent, from about 400 to the mid-600s in Egypt, and from about 550 to the late 600s in northern Africa. Today, I'll focus on the arts of 3 different Orthodox Christian polities in northern and eastern Africa. Each politically independent from one another, they interacted through Christian belief and shared regional visual culture. First is Egypt, when it was part of the Byzantine Empire from 395 to 641 CE. Second is the Aksumite Empire and its successor, the Ethiopian Empire, in what are now Eritrea and Ethiopia. Aksum existed from about 150 BCE to about 900 CE, and the Ethiopian Empire from about 1140 to 1974, so into the lifetime of some of the people sitting in this room today. And third, I'll be looking at the Christian kingdoms of Nubia, which existed from the 6th through 16th centuries in what is now Sudan and southern Egypt. Called Awa, Makoria, and Nobadia, they later merged into a single entity called Datawo. Concentrating on art from these 3 areas shows how they were not culturally dominated by Byzantium, which fell in 1453. Instead, it demonstrates how artists look to their African artistic past as well as to their cosmopolitan present. Whoop. It's a very fidgety laptop today. To begin, I'll give a brief history of Christianity in the late antique period, that is, the 200s to the 600s, and how it impacted art making through today. Then, I'll consider the legacy of pharaonic Egyptian art in Roman and later Byzantine era Egypt. And I'll note that the Byzantine Empire called itself the Eastern Roman Empire, so that connection was very strong to them. Moving on to two Christian polities that were always independent of Byzantium, I'll then consider arts from Nubia and Aksum and its inheritor, Ethiopia. Overall, we'll learn how African artists in these areas participated in a regional visual culture that was linked by the Christian faith, while also drawing from their African artistic heritage. Throughout the talk, you'll see installation photos that I took in African Byzantium at the Cleveland Museum of Art, as well as photographs that I've taken over the last decade or so in Ethiopia and Egypt. In late antiquity, about the years 284 to 641 CE, communities across the Mediterranean, Nile, and Sahara regions shared the experience of becoming Christian. Christianity and Christians had been active in Africa since the faith's beginning in the 30s CE. For example, Mark the Evangelist, an author of one of the Bible's books, entered Egypt and brought the church to the city of Alexandria at that point. However, it wasn't until the 300s that Christianity became the faith of any ruling power. The world's first Christian nation was Armenia, which made Christianity its state religion in 301. The second Christian nation in the world was the Aksumite Empire in Eastern Africa, in the present-day nations of Ethiopia and Eritrea. Aksum's Emperor Ezana chose to convert and made Christianity his empire's faith in 330 CE. At left, bearing his name and likeness, his coin with a cross was the first ever coin to bear a Christian symbol. Now, Byzantium's Emperor Theodosius made Christianity his realm's faith too, but that wasn't until 50 years later, in 380. As a consequence, Christianity then became the official faith of the land in Egypt, which was under Byzantine political control. The independent Nubian kingdoms of Nobadia, Makoria, and Alwa gradually adopted Christianity by choice in the 500s. This decision brought their royal courts into dialogue with fellow Christian power Byzantium, though again, Nubia always remained politically independent. And throughout the Orthodox world, networks of varying strength linked fledgling Christian nations, and pilgrimage centers were frequent connection points. This period's art reflects the constant evolution of the faith as multivocal sects, councils, and individuals shaped Orthodox Christian beliefs and practices. Key among these were something called ecumenical councils, where religious officials discussed questions about Christianity. 7 councils happened in the late antique era as leaders tried to create a Christian consensus. This failed, however, as some people chose to accept council decisions, while others rejected them. The beliefs of different Orthodox faiths reflect these differences and divide them into Eastern and Oriental branches. The Eastern Orthodox churches include Greek Orthodoxy, while the Oriental Orthodox churches include Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Coptic Egyptian orthodoxies. Such religious differences within Orthodoxy impact both how artists work and what they depicted. From the late antique through early modern eras, again about 200 to 1800 CE, distinctive Christian artistic models traversed geographies. Portable arts and luxury goods circulated as gifts, souvenirs, or personal acquisitions. Upon these objects' arrival from Africa or beyond, artists did not unthinkingly copy them, but adapted them with local flair. Some of these adaptations reflected differences between Orthodox Christianities. For example, Byzantine artists could make sculptures and figurative relief carvings, such as that at left on view in CMA's collection galleries, while Ethiopian Orthodoxy prohibited sculptures as graven images or idols. It literally interprets a passage from the biblical book of Exodus that says, "Thou shalt not make graven images." This Ethiopian Orthodox prohibition on sculpture prompted its artists to become expert painters. They created works like this triptych painting on view in Africa and Byzantium. Other artistic differences reflected local tastes in fashion or language. We can see in this painting how the Christ child wears a cowrie shell necklace that young Ethiopian boys would wear, and Mary sits on a local throne bed, just like an Ethiopian empress. Artistic media, be it mosaic, weaving, casting, or painting, also impacted what was created. Given this complex, intertwined history, it's important to remember that when we consider the art history and artworks of Christian Nubia, Aksum, Ethiopia, and Byzantium, we are not comparing apples to apples, to invoke a popular idiom, but perhaps apples to kiwis. Both are fruit, but the flavor, color, and texture are different. Past art historians and curators incorrectly describe Nubian, and especially Ethiopian Christian arts as, quote, derivative of Byzantine arts. Equally, they overlook the continued importance of the African artistic past in Egyptian, Nubian, and Ethiopian artworks. By reclaiming these art histories, we better understand the artworks, their makers, and their users. Let's now consider how Christian Ethiopians, Nubian, and Byzantine-era Egyptians connected with one another through faith and art. Northern Africans in an area they called Kemet created rich objects and structures in service of their faith. What we now call ancient Egypt became a Roman imperial province in 30 BCE, ending millennia of rule by Egypt-based pharaohs. To varying degrees, pharaonic-era Egyptian iconography, or images or symbols, have been incorporated into all civilizations in Egypt since. Egypt was politically part of the Byzantine Empire for only 246 years, between 395 and 641. During that time, the religion was officially Christian, yet Egypt's old religion endured. See, for example, a cross carved into this temple at Philae, one of the last places where the Egyptian goddess Isis continued to be worshipped well into the 500s. My first case study are textiles woven in late antique Egypt. For millennia, Egyptians living under pharaonic rule mummified their dead. They buried them with things to use in the afterlife. With adaptations, this northern African burial culture continued after the Romans gained control over Egypt in 30 BCE. It endured into the late antique era, when Byzantium ruled Egypt from about 395 CE. In Egypt, burial customs and a dry climate preserved magnificent textiles. Household objects like the tall curtains at right became burial shrouds when wrapped around the body. They took on a second life after being unearthed for their third, and most likely unexpected life, in a museum. We vividly see the second life as shrouds in the stains that are on the curtains. The woven flowers and birds on the curtain in the exhibition resemble textiles surrounding the remains of a weaver named Euphemia. She lived between the 5th and 7th centuries in Byzantine-ruled Egypt. Out of respect for her, I have not shown a photograph of her body, which is exhibited in a museum in Brussels, Belgium. She was buried wearing garments and with textiles surrounding her body. Pillows with woven round designs supported her feet and head. Such burials are the source for all Coptic textiles in museums, including these fragments at Dallas. Compare them to the neck and cuff trim of these rare surviving whole garments in a museum in Cairo. Collectors and dealers once cut out the designs from the plain woven textile. This impacts our understanding of them, as their practical function as parts of garments or as home furnishings no longer becomes obvious when separated from the whole cloth. Symbols also persisted from pharaonic Egypt into the Byzantine era. This tapestry was woven in Byzantine-controlled Egypt in the 500s. Then, a book of Roman Christian laws called the Theodosian Code prohibited Egypt's so-called pagan, polytheistic, or multi-god faith. Yet, despite this prohibition, popular Egyptian religious belief persisted. Here, the weaver formed a red ankh by topping a T shape with a circular wreath in place of a cross. Such cross ankhs were also carved into stone and shaped in metal, as seen at right. Like their polytheist or multi-god neighbors, Christians took the ankh as a sign of eternal life. Crosses and ankhs were not only linked, but they were interchangeable. Even after cultural traumas like the polytheism ban, religion persisted in artistic practices. The ankh symbol in the tapestry was a clear sign of Egypt's enduring artistic past. Yet, those legacies are not always so clear. By removing or downplaying evidence of Africa's artistic history, some past archaeologists, art historians, and curators skewed our understanding. They made it seem like Egyptians had fully embraced Hellenic culture, that's culture from Greece or Rome, and forgotten their own African culture. And I'll use this case study of portraits placed on mummified remains in Roman-ruled Egypt to consider this. The cultural custom of preserving bodies, often by mummification, and burying them with grave goods was inherited from ancient Egyptian religious practices. Greeks and Romans in the Hellenic world didn't practice mummification. They cremated or buried remains. Despite political changes, ancient Egyptian mummification practices endured. Yet art historical prejudice prevented us from fully seeing this. Western art history has valued sculpture and painting most, especially that from ancient Greece and Rome. A Roman-era funerary mask made of layered papyrus and plaster, on view at the Dallas Museum of Art, and 2 painted funerary portraits in the CMA's presentation of Africa and Byzantium, are examples of how this art historical bias of the past tried to hide Egypt's connections with its own African past. In a 1972 article, the Egyptologist John Cooney wrote about the portraits now in Cleveland. He noted that the portraits were cut from decorated linen shrouds, and I quote him here, "However interesting the complete shroud would have been in its intact condition, it is perhaps as well, in an artistic sense, that it has not come down to us, for these shrouds embraced Hellenistic art only in the representation of the head," end quote. He described the rest of the body covering as painted with, quote, "a series of exotic and debased Egyptian sacred symbols," end quote. Saving only the Hellenic painted elements while discarding and disparaging the Egyptian elements is essentially tampering with evidence. It centers Western culture, and it hides how arts and cultures truly blended in the past. When we look instead at the whole context in which these paintings were made, their African heritage becomes clearer. 50 years after their acquisition, we do that for the first time in this exhibition. Egyptian-style burial customs and arts persisted throughout Greek, Roman, and Byzantine rule over Egypt between 305 BCE and 641 CE. The people depicted in these panels lived between cultures. It's only when we see the painting's original context, with the rest of the body case along with the painting, that we can understand this. The individual or their family's choice of mummification reflected historical Egyptian practices of creating a physical duplicate for the deceased soul to rest in. And their decision to color one woman's lips gold may symbolize how death transformed someone into something called an Ak, an effective spirit. The continued use of hieroglyphics and Egyptian religious symbols showed the continuation of this religion long after the pharaoh's rules ended. In contrast, the clothing and hairstyle showed the embrace of contemporary ideals of Hellenic or Greco-Roman Egyptian identity. We can study Roman and Byzantine-era Egyptian textiles due to the continuation of older African burial practices, as well as the area's dry, hot climate, which preserves organic materials. And I've heard that hot, dry climate actually gets to a similar low humidity in Texas later on in the year, about 30%. So you can imagine exactly how that feels here. And while it's easy to assume that if something doesn't exist now, it wasn't or it couldn't have been made long ago, but we must consider the differences between cultures, climates, and geographies, and textiles are prime art historical examples for that. Unlike Egyptians, Ethiopians did not recycle textiles as burial goods or shrouds. Moreover, Egyptian Muslim burials did not include grave goods, and Orthodox Christians used very few. Even if they had recycled textiles as grave goods, Ethiopia's soil is much wetter and more acidic, and that acid in the soil would have just eaten up the organic materials of the textiles. Of the few remaining historical Ethiopian textiles, such as these tremendous tablet-woven silks, some are still used in churches, as we see at left, and still others are at Western museums because of historical British looting, as seen at right. And we can't ethically include these in an exhibition, even though they are part of the story. But as these examples demonstrate, even under Byzantine rule, Egyptians drew from their African past. In the second half of my talk, I'll focus on arts from Nubia and Ethiopia, which, unlike Egypt, were never politically part of the Byzantine Empire. This section foregrounds African agency and creativity by recounting how African artists chose, rejected, or adapted elements of foreign art while also making their own artistic innovations and celebrating their heritage. After its short presence of about 175 years in northern Africa and about 300 years in Egypt, Byzantium's borders shrank as it lost territory. New Muslim polities rose in its place, cultivating religious diversity and artistic creativity. Northern and Eastern African Christian communities remained interconnected, each continuing to exchange emissaries or diplomats with Byzantium. While of the same faith, differences in administrations, arts, and cultures often resulted in complex politically charged relationships. Nonetheless, people and artworks continued to circulate throughout the region. Always independent of Byzantium, Eastern African Christian kingdoms in Nubia and Ethiopia continued to flourish, and so too did smaller Christian communities in areas now under Muslim rule. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Empire. I'll turn first to Nubia, heading southward down the Nile River into Eastern Africa. With its capital moving from different sites over the centuries, the Nubian kingdom of Kush began around 1069 BCE. Kush ended in around 350 CE, likely due to the military efforts of the Ethiopian Empire of Aksum. Soon, a series of regional elite organizations transformed and grew into new kingdoms. The independent Nubian kingdoms of Nobadia, Makoria, and Alwa gradually adopted Christianity by choice in the 500s. Cosmopolitan Nubian Christian cities were centers of arts, trade, religion, and learning. Always politically independent, Nubian royalty were culturally linked with the Byzantine Empire. Many Nubian people were multilingual. They spoke Greek, and they filled their tombs with artworks that intertwined Nubian, late Greco-Roman, as well as Byzantine elements. Now, choosing to become Christian and adapt aspects of Byzantine dress and court culture, however, did not mean forgetting one's past. Nubian arts from the late antique era showcased their elite owners' political and artistic lineage while demonstrating their access to foreign goods. This stunning late antique Nubian bridal chest blends Nubian and Hellenic arts. It was excavated from a tomb in the cemetery of Balana, made just at the end of the kingdom of Kush and before Nubia's leaders decided to become Christian. When these boxes were first unearthed in archaeological digs during the 1930s, scholars asserted that they were made in Byzantine-ruled Egypt and then imported into Nubia. They couldn't say that Nubian artists had made them. However, we now acknowledge that Nubian artists skillfully made these objects, drawing from their artistic heritage, as well as imagery from the Hellenic world. At right are ivory furniture inlays from the Nubian kingdom of Kerma, and later inlays from the kingdom of Kush. Making furniture with copper and ivory was a long practiced artistic talent in Nubia. The German archaeologists who in the 1930s were being willfully ignorant about the facts, as well as frankly being quite racist. The resemblance between the Nubian boxes that are on view and these far older Nubian furniture inlays is undeniable, and their creation is undeniably African. Continuing that line of thought, I'll dwell on my favorite piece in the exhibition, which could really sum up its thesis. This is a king's crown made just before Nubian rulers chose to become Christian in the 500s. Nubian kings and queens maintained indigenous symbols in their royal attire, even as they forged relationships with their Christian counterparts in the nearby Aksumite Empire and very distant Byzantium. This broad circle of gem-encrusted beaten silver is full of symbols that evoke traditional Nile Valley signs of authority, and notably, it does not look at all like a Byzantine crown. Here, I contrast a detail of the crown with the Sphinx of Taharqa. Taharqa was the last ruler of the period when Nubian pharaohs ruled over ancient Egypt in the 25th dynasty, 754 BCE to 756. The legacy of Taharqa and his leadership over Egypt resonated throughout generations. The crown also features a ram's head adapted from the kingdom of Kush, as seen in the 6th century BCE ram's head earring at right. Amun was a powerful ram-headed deity who protected the Kushite kings. While referring to Nubian heritage, the crown is studded with gemstones set using Byzantine techniques. Here, polished stones called cabochons were placed into a metal rim. We see a similar setting in a Byzantine married woman's jewelry set from about the same era in the exhibition in Cleveland. This crown demonstrates how its African wearer knew the power of both his artistic and political Nubian legacy, and as well as his connections with contemporary regional culture. Through works like these on view in Africa and Byzantium, we understand both the unique histories of distinctive African civilizations, as well as how they participated in greater regional spheres of faith, politics, and visual culture. While politically independent, Nubia's Christian kingdom's courtly culture and arts followed Byzantine trends. This was due to direct Byzantine intervention. However, this changed in the medieval era, when the Byzantine Empire became distant after losing control over Egypt. Medieval Nubian artists reflected this political exchange through increased self-representation and historical references. This painting is from the pharaohs Cathedral, founded in the 600s. Artists painted it with images of biblical figures, Nubian church officials, and Nubian royalty between the 600s and 1100s. In this painting from the 1100s, Christ holds a book in his left hand, raising his right hand in blessing to protect a young man. The young man is identified in writing as Prince Aaron, and he wears Nubian royal garments, including a flared robe, a sash, and a crown with a half moon. This crescent projection was a reference to Nubian power from far, far earlier. It is linked to the Nubian lion god Epidemic, god of war and conquest. Imagery of Epidemic grew during the period that the kingdom of Kush had its capital at a place called Meroe, around 270 BCE to 350 CE. The Nubian god Epidemic is often depicted standing over a crescent moon, and his female companion, Amasemi, often has a crescent moon in her hair. Nubian crowns of the same era, such as this one on view at the Nubian Museum in Aswan, Egypt, also featured the crescent moon prominently. Now remember, this painting was made in the 1100s. This means that the painter, and indeed the young prince, were going back hundreds and hundreds of years into Nubian history to reference a local symbol of African power, at the same time as they were participating in this regional network of Orthodox Christian cultures. There remains so much to learn about Christian Nubia. From at least the 8th through 15th centuries, they changed from primarily using Greek to their own language called Old Nubian. Many of these texts remain untranslated. Ongoing archaeology in Sudan also adds to our partial picture of the region's art and culture. And only last year, Polish archaeologists discovered a unique Nubian painting showing a ruler bowing to Christ. And this particular imagery has never been found in any kind of Christian art anywhere in the world. Now, we turn to the Horn of Africa in the eastern part of the African continent. We focus on the Empire of Aksum, which existed from around 150 BCE to about 900 CE, and its successor, the Empire of Ethiopia, which existed from about 1140 to 1974. Ethiopian Christianity predates that of Byzantium, and globally developed later than only that of Armenia. Aksum's Emperor Ezana chose to convert himself and his realm in 330 CE. Ethiopian and Byzantine Orthodoxy had different rites and dogma, which their texts, language, and arts reflected. And as I'd mentioned earlier, while sculpture and figurative relief carving were major Byzantine expressive forms, Ethiopian Orthodoxy prohibited sculptures as graven images. Politically, Ethiopia was independent of Byzantium and outlasted it by centuries. Many Ethiopic language texts attest to Ethiopians' belief in their superiority over Byzantium, and moreover, the two were politically and militarily allied in the 6th century. When describing his own empire in relation to others, the 15th century Ethiopian emperor Zar-Yaakub wrote, and I quote, "The faith of the people of Ethiopia is as bright as the sun, and as the sun is greater than the moon, and as gold is more precious than silver, similarly the faith of the people of Ethiopia, of the Sea of Mark, is greater and more precious than that of other Christians," end quote. And by other Christians, he of course meant Byzantium, which had ended in 1453. And in contrast, Zar-Yaakub's empire endured until 1974. Such facts undermine scholarly and popular declarations that Ethiopia was subordinate to Byzantium and that its arts were mere derivatives. Ethiopia is the second oldest Christian nation in the world, yet it is a challenge from an art historical perspective to discuss the arts of Christian Ethiopia and their relationship with the Christian arts of Byzantium. There are several reasons for major gaps in the art historical record when it comes to Ethiopian Christian art and architecture from before 1500. Environmental or geographic effects have distorted our art historical theorizing by reducing available objects and sites that are available to study. For example, around the 7th century, earthquakes and tsunamis destroyed the Aksumite Empire's port at Adulis, which is now in Eritrea. Where sites do exist, archaeologists have often overlooked them because of biases about what they believed African civilizations were capable of. Archaeological excavation is still in its infancy as a discipline across much of the African continent, and it's only in the last decade or so that many major new finds have been uncovered in the former Aksumite Empire. Each find enhances our art history, such as Christian basilicas intermingled with pagan arrangements of cow skulls at the Aksumite city of Beta Samati, or luxurious goods in an Aksumite grave that date Roman Aksumite trade to centuries earlier than once believed. Even months ago, a study was published that showed how Aksumite carved ivory rings were buried in England with Anglo-Saxon elites. Human-made disasters also created absences in the physical record. Ethiopia has experienced multiple such events over the centuries, including the destruction of most early Ethiopian Christian art and architecture during the Ethio-Adal War in the 1500s and the British looting of the capital city Magdala in 1868. For all these environmental, geographic, or human-made reasons, there are fewer Christian Ethiopian artworks available for study than were historically made, thus creating an incomplete historical record. When one couples these absences with often racist theories of colonial-era origin, that African artists and civilizations could not create certain kinds of artworks, or could only derive their artworks from certain other civilizations, the myth of Ethiopian art being derivative of Byzantine art remains no less shocking, but its origins become more obvious. While significant, the gap in the art historical record is narrowing, and these biases are being debunked in some ways, thanks to increased archaeology, study, and interest. But despite that, it does remain hard, if not nearly impossible, to talk about late antique art from the Empire of Aksum, or of Ethiopian Christian art before 1540, because of that gap in the visual record. That doesn't mean, however, that pre-Christian or the pre-1500s Christian art from Ethiopia didn't exist. Texts written by foreign visitors and Ethiopian authors alike tell us more about it. And as I move through these two quotes, I ask you to consider, how do we know what we know? And why do we think about certain kinds of art? And why do we think what we think about art made by certain people from certain places in the world? In the 600s, two Muslim women named Habiba and Salma took refuge under imperial protection in Ethiopia, which was then the Christian Aksumite Empire. When they returned home, they explained to their husband, the Prophet Muhammad, how beautiful the Church of Mary was in Ethiopia and how it contained pictures or paintings. The quantity, quality, and impressiveness of Ethiopian art and architecture only grew over the centuries, as an account by the Yemeni author Shahab al-Din Ahmed ibn Abd al-Qadir testifies to. In the 1560s, he wrote, "The Imam asked all the Arabs who were with him and said to them, 'Is there the like of this church at Transamariam, with its images and its gold in Byzantium or in India or in any other place? They replied, no, we have never seen nor heard of its like in Byzantium or India or anywhere else in the world. It is only through texts like this that we know of the glories of the Church of Etrunsumadium, as soldiers destroyed it during the Ethiopian-Adal War. By its writing, the Byzantine Empire had fallen over a century earlier, and in contrast, the always independent Empire of Ethiopia endured until 1974. Influence, though debated in some art historical spheres, was a guiding interpretive thread for much of Ethiopianist art history. Influence, however, doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is rather tied to people who have a capacity to compel changes in another person's ideas, behavior, or actions. What change occurs, of course, depends on the ultimate decisions of the person to whom that influence is applied. And when we talk about art, that means the decision to respond to or not to respond to an influence that was made by an artist or the patron who hired them to make an artwork. Despite artistic evidence, the centrality of foreign artistic influence has been a long-standing feature of Ethiopianist art history, though Ethiopia was never part of Byzantium and had a different orthodoxy. Even some scholarship written in the 2020s still calls Ethiopian Christian art Afro-Byzantine. In contrast, the artworks in Africa and Byzantium show how distinctive artistic models traversed geographies and were translated on arrival with local flair, reflecting how Ethiopian Christian art, like Ethiopian Christianity itself, was constantly evolving. At left is an illumination of St. Luke from the Abba Garima Gospel, an illuminated gospel still in use at an Ethiopian monastery. And at right, two works from a gospel on view in Africa and Byzantium. Radiocarbon dating of the Abba Garima Gospels dates them to the late 300s to early 600s, making them among the earliest existing manuscripts illustrated with Christian images anywhere in the world. The illustrations in the Abba Garima Gospel have strong connections with Coptic Egyptian painting and also include images of men who are called the evangelists. And I illustrate here all different images of the evangelists to show not only the antiquity of illuminated manuscripts in Ethiopia, but also how they evolved over time. And at right, we see St. Luke and St. Mark in a more Ethiopianized format from a rare manuscript remaining from the 1400s. They wear local dress, use local writing tools, and are surrounded by wing-like elements that mimic designs seen in Ethiopian manuscripts, as well as processional crosses. And there's a great example upstairs on view in the African gallery with those wing-like motifs. While there's a major gap in the record of pre-1500s Ethiopian Christian art, some truly spectacular architectural sites do remain. Our CMA exhibition design celebrates African architecture, with Ethiopia as the primary reference point. The Ethiopian church complex of Lalibela, hewn from the living rock in phases between the 7th and 13th centuries, is our major point of departure. You step inside the exhibition and you come face to face with an enormous photo wallpaper of the cross-shaped church of Georgis at left and an evocation of the facade of the Church of Emmanuel at right, and that's the Church of Emmanuel itself. When you process into the next room and peek through windows, these windows echo both the forms of Aksumite imperial stelae, which you can see how big they are compared to me as a grad student doing field work there. And these windows are also used at the Lalibela churches. And through these windows, you catch a glimpse of later parts of the exhibition. And we're asking you to literally look through an Ethiopian perspective, to take an African view on the works in the exhibition. And by referencing Ethiopian architecture in the exhibition design, we valorize African architectural achievement and evoke the time, space, and place that many artworks in the exhibition are connected to. Around the 1500s, Christian Ethiopians chose the round church as their preferred structure. Its architecture was unlike anything in Byzantium, Egypt, or Nubia. Ethiopian churches are centered on a square sanctuary with ample flat space to adhere paintings on cloth, a unique practice globally in early modern Christendom. Artistic creation flourished in Ethiopia between 1453 and 1855. Responding to changing local contexts, artists innovated new forms and visually translated imported artworks. patrons eager to show their devotion endowed churches with both Ethiopian and foreign art. Shown on the sanctuary-like structure in our galleries, the painting cycle from the Abba and Tonis Church is one of 3 remaining from early 17th century Ethiopia. Before we look more closely at these Ethiopian church paintings, which are our final case study here, I want to talk a bit about artists in the field of African art history. The object labels in the exhibition echo those that I've written for CMA's African Arts Galleries, which always acknowledge makers, even when we don't know their name. A key myth about African arts is that their creators are anonymous, either unknown mysteries or names that foreigners neglected to record. Another myth is that tribes, rather than individuals, made a work. And this is an oversimplification that neglects nuances of style, artistic individuality, regional aesthetics, temporal changes, and other creative contexts in Africa. And the Dallas Museum of Art's own Dr. Rosalind Walker has done much to unravel this myth of the so-called anonymous African artist. And in 1998, Dr. Walker published the groundbreaking exhibition catalog, Olowe Evise, A Yoruba Sculptor to Kings, and the companion article, Olowe Evise, Anonymous Has a Name. And here she wrote of Olowe Evise, a Yoruba sculptor from Nigeria, regarded amongst the best of the 20th century for his innovative high relief carving. And through her study of the accounts of foreigners, photographs of his works in Nigeria, and his praise song, his oriki, which is a form of indigenous oral knowledge, Dr. Walker gave a name and biography to this artist, deepening our understanding of his creative output and importance. Still, other stories exist about why an African artist may or may not be named, impacting what we present on labels. Acquired to the CMA's African Arts Department last year, this is the first Ethiopian painting to enter CMA's collection. It's a key image of the exhibition, and it depicts 13 holy men, the apostles plus St. Paul. It's pretty large scale, around this big, would have been suited for an elite home or a church. And we see each saint wearing fashionable clothing imported from India, which is what figures of the Ethiopian court would have worn. And while they all look a little bit similar to emphasize their group identity as the apostles, the artist has taken great care to show their faces and their hairstyles with individuality. Customarily, an Ethiopian painter did not sign his work because doing so was considered being prideful before God. And in a recent onstage conversation that I had with an Egyptian icon painter named George McCary, we discussed how the idea of signing one's work in Coptic Egyptian icons and church paintings is still a topic of controversy in 2024. However, some Ethiopian church painters did rarely sign their name. And however, we see in this painting from the Church of Abba Antonis, the painter of Waldemariam must have been very proud of his work, and I can see why, it's gorgeous, that he actually signed, the painter is Waldemariam. He signed in the language Ge'ez. And we'll see 4 other paintings by Waldemariam from that church in the exhibition. And it's through these paintings and this rare attribution by the maker of the painting that we now attribute the diptych painting now at the CMA to Waldemariam, or a member of his circle. Art historians have too often been Eurocentric and have underutilized African sources. And this is despite rich textual documentation of both sites and objects. And in contrast, text sources confirm how Ethiopian rulers of the medieval and early modern eras were not passive recipients of foreign art or religion. To the contrary, they wrote letters to their royal peers requesting artworks and artisans, and those within Ethiopia's church sought to bring in valued artworks from outside. And despite this interest in bringing in prestigious foreign imports, locally made works still held intense value. So in the Ethiopian Christian Empire, each ruler had a chronicle written about their reign, essentially the story of everything they did. And I cite an 18th century chronicle, which is inserted on the far side of the screen. And it describes a textile-covered painting of Mary, which was commissioned as well as dreamed up by an empress named Menteweb. The chronicler wrote of this unusual textile-dressed painting, and he praises the painting, finding it superior to those that were imported from Jerusalem and Egypt, which included Cretan-style icons. And though the particular painting that he was writing about was destroyed, a similar painting from the Church of Chalikot Selassie right to my side here, testifies to its likely beauty. And as artworks prove, connection or adaptation did not mean erasing African cultures or mechanically copying Byzantine or other Christian art. The continued flows of long-practiced faiths and art forms complemented the free modification and selection of meaningful aspects of religion or culture, as well as a dismissal of what was not. In short, artists engaged in conscious cultural appropriation, making choices all along the way. Outlasting their political power, elements of historical beliefs and arts from the Byzantine Empire, the Aksumite Empire, the Empire of Ethiopia, and the Nubian Christian kingdoms remain central in people's lives today. Throughout our exhibition at the CMA, we present the written and film perspectives of Greater Clevelanders whose faiths and histories reflect this faith and heritage reflect these histories. And the presence of these community voices, and indeed many aspects of the installation, reflect community outreach I began in 2021, once pandemic conditions allowed. Their photographic contributions also shown alongside images from contemporary northeastern Africa and the Mediterranean basin, demonstrate the relevance of these arts and cultures right in our own backyard and connect us across the ocean to other places in the world. Artists making religious or tradition-based contemporary artworks still see historical artworks as launching pads for their own imaginations. And in April 2024, Canadian-Egyptian painter George Macari created an icon at the Cleveland Museum of Art. It reflects the CMA's Egyptian Virgin and Child tapestry from the 500s, as well as Macari's training as a disciple of the Egyptian artist Isaac Fanous. Fanous created Neo-Coptic art in the 20th century. Fanous reinvigorated Coptic painting in the 20th century by looking at ancient Egyptian art from the time of the pharaohs, as well as recent global modern art, like Cubism. He did not consult Byzantine Orthodox iconography, but rather Egypt's Coptic Orthodox painting canon. And we're very honored that a Cleveland area Coptic community member has lent CMA one of Fanous's Neo-Coptic icons, which you see at center. And so just as the historical artists whose creations we feature in this exhibition did, contemporary tradition-based artists look to their past as they draw from the world around them to create their present. Now reaching the end of my talk, I return to where I began. Our presentation of Africa and Byzantium seeks to center Africa from the late antique through early modern eras, foregrounding ideas of patronage, agency, and creativity as we consider the relationships between northern Eastern African kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire. In our journey to validate and celebrate the arts of one culture, let us not diminish another, but instead use our platforms and museums to tell new narratives. And today, I hope my lecture has expanded your narratives around the historical arts of Egypt, Ethiopia, Nubia, and Byzantium. Modernity and Byzantium are not identical, and instead, artworks that draw from the African past of the Christian kingdoms of Nubia, Byzantine-era Egypt, and the empires of Aksum, and later Ethiopia, should be acknowledged as celebrations of that continent's visual heritage, which drew only selectively from elements of Byzantine art and life. In these new narratives of circulation and visual translation in northern and eastern Africa, we find the needed alternatives to the skewed specific narratives or single stories about Africa decried by Haitian anthropologist Boshell Trudeau in the 1990s and by Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in the 2000s. And when using these new narratives to reconsider the arts of the Aksumite Empire, Christian Nubia, and the Empire of Ethiopia, all formerly thought to be Byzantine derivatives, it becomes clear that these arts shine bright as the sun, original and worthy expressions of faith and creativity. I thank you for spending time with me this afternoon at the Dallas Museum of Art, and I warmly invite you all to Cleveland to see Africa and Byzantium through July 21st. And I'm very happy to take any questions, so thank you all.
If you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll come around with a mic.
Hello, my name is Ilian Hill, and I'm a professor of art history. And thank you so very much for this really wonderful talk that draws out some of the oversights of art historical research. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about good ways of teaching some of this material that would continue to emphasize African agency. I'm also interested in hearing more about some of the exhibition ethics that you mentioned, of not showing human remains and trying to think what the second thing. Not displaying looted objects. So I would love to hear more about that, and if that's a policy of the museum or if that's something that you personally have adopted in your work. So thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you. That was such a kind compliment, and I look forward to chatting with you more. Certainly in terms of teaching, I think it is a matter of exposure. I think about my own training as an undergraduate, and in the sort of classical canon of African arts, Nubia, Egypt, they really weren't treated well. So when I had the opportunity to start teaching myself, I started adding in Nubia, Sudan, and I really think it is from the earliest levels exposing people. And I often tell a story about how I got my first exposure to art history in second grade from my art teacher, Mrs. Lebo, who showed us slides of art history, and I think I was the only kid who loved it. But Mrs. Lebo showed these slides of ancient Egypt, and I was hooked. I got a book from the Scholastic Book Fair about ancient Egypt and one about how to write hieroglyphics. But I looked at that book recently. It had the word Africa in it once. And so it only took me till much later in my life to realize it was African art that I had been so intrigued by. And I think when we start from the youngest levels, it's emphasizing that African history. It's finding translations of these texts in African languages. It's bringing African artists and authors onto syllabi. And even as we think about the late antique and ancient period, having Egypt on the same syllabus as Rome and Greece and adding Aksum into the mix, it really is embracing that kind of connectivity that I think will be the most helpful in terms of building awareness of these wonderful worlds and their arts. To your second question about ethics of presentation, it's always such an honor to be a curator. And in my own practice, as someone who is responsible for the collection of African arts in these exhibitions, I always center honor and respect at my work, and knowing particularly that in most cases, it's coming from outside my own background. So always listening to people. I think increasingly in the field of African arts, we are being aware of the history of the past, which can be quite mundane, somebody buying a piece of art at a market, or it can be something far less mundane or civil. And so we need to be aware of this and to think about building those kind of ethics into our work. And when you visit the exhibition in Cleveland, we actually have a panel that talks about collecting contexts, so thinking about provenance, burial goods. We also have many actively sacred objects in the exhibition. We've been very blessed to borrow works from the Holy Monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai. And in anticipation of these and other works in the exhibition, I consulted with local faith leaders, asking them, is there anything in particular we should or shouldn't do in terms of handling? What about the casework? What about a gallery in our museum already that you like or don't like? We actually had one of the fathers from Sinai help us installing the pieces there. And we've worked across departments to welcome people who wish to venerate or show respect to icons or other religious objects. So building that into the ethics of the exhibition and acknowledging that these may be historical objects, but they're also active objects of faith for many.
Thank you very much. I was just fascinated by this, and you're clearly passionate about this, and I know it's the art probably primarily, but I was also struck, when I think of the history of Christianity, there's a lot of violence. And maybe that's just the way history is told, and maybe they're leaving out some stuff. But my question for you is, for these three kingdoms here that you're talking about, they seem to have a very good, cordial relationships with each other. I'm sure it wasn't always that way over hundreds of years. There's probably been some dust-ups, but I just was wondering, is that part of what you've learned all over these years? Is that there was different regions, different countries, different peoples can come together and appreciate what each one can bring, rather than trying to tell people, no, you're supposed to do it our way. Is that part of what you think that you've really enjoyed learning about?
I think you hit the nail on the head in saying that things change over time, and it very much depends on the moment. There's a moment in the history of Nubia where their kingdom, the kingdom of Kush, essentially ends because of Ethiopian military advances. We also have later, in something I didn't speak about in the talk, but that's very present in the exhibition, after the Byzantine Empire loses its territory on the African continent, it's Muslim leaders who are in place. And Muslim leaders believe that people of the book, so the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, are all of a certain protected status, and they allow people to live their lives according to their laws and faith. And it's during the Byzantine Empire, for example, the Jews are persecuted, but many Jews come to Egypt in particular for religious acceptance. So things always are changing over time. But it is quite fascinating through my work, and particularly my work in this exhibition. You see how art does remain a touchstone that connects people across time and faith and place. And sometimes it can be a religious object that moves across cultures. Sometimes it can be something like a geometric pattern or a motif. But there is this very human visual condition that does end up uniting folks.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. It was super enlightening. You mentioned before that the first Christian nation in the world was Armenia, and then the second one was Ethiopia. How did those ideas, I guess, or the religion go all the way down to Ethiopia from Armenia if they were the second one?
People were on the move at that point. You had people who were called, so if I back up a little bit, monasticism, so monks, people who live a very plain, simple life, preaching the faith, that came out of Egypt, and monks were on the move. Christianity had been in Egypt since the time it was basically formed. And initially, Christianity was outlawed in most places. It's only later on, as oftentimes leaders convert and then it kind of trickles down. Sometimes it's from the bottom up. But it's people who are moving. They are constantly sending diplomats to one another. There is global trade. And in fact, the coins that I showed from that Aksumite empire in Ethiopia, they issue them in 2 languages. They issue them in Greek for global trade and in Ge'ez, their own local language, for local trade. So there's already these links of trade and commerce. And those are connections through with faith and ideas and artworks, and people also move. So it's very much this intense period of connectivity, an intense period of discussion.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for a really incredible talk today. And I wonder if you might share some of your personal discoveries along the way that helped to formulate this approach that I find to be unique here in your talk in overlaying multiple perspectives and sort of threads, because as you talk about some of the challenges that art historians face in having this very singular view, you know, and not even referencing certain texts or materials and things like that, that's one of the ways that it can continue to be so narrow. So I imagine there were some discoveries and some key turning points along the way, even as you said, learning that what initially intrigued you early on as a child was one word that was in the text, you know. So just a little bit of your personal discoveries along the way that helped to really open up the perspective and sort of overlay these different lenses in your work.
Absolutely. And I would say I credit a lot to my training in the Africanist branch of art history. We are trained to be able to hold multiple truths and to respect multiple truths. There is a primacy to the written word in a lot of Western art history and Western philosophy. For example, a German philosopher in the 1800s, Hegel, wrote that Africa was not part of history, had no written history. It's when you start to question those things that you have these moments of revelation. And in African history, we often give weight to oral traditions when there is history, when there are stories, when there are the oriki, the praise poems that tell you about an artist. So we're often encouraged and really trained as second nature to think about the sources. I've also been grateful for mentors who've always told me to figure it out and don't base your work on other people's mistakes. So chase down those footnotes, chase down those resources, go to the place yourself. And one key revelation that I had when doing my dissertation fieldwork in Ethiopia, I was working on the time period in the 1600s when the Jesuits, who are Roman Catholics, went to Ethiopia and tried to convert folks who had already been Christian for 1,100 years to Christianity. All of the scholarship, much of it was written when Italy had colonial intent on Ethiopia, made it seem like Baroque churches just flew in like UFOs into the Ethiopian mountains. When you actually got to the churches, though, or to the palaces, when you got up those mountains to hike up, you could see elements from the Aksumite Empire in the structures. And it was as if people had just had blinders on and they weren't seeing them. Or there had been written sources that had been translated for hundreds of years that had either information about the names of Ethiopian architects, of Indian master craftspeople, of Egyptian cement makers, all of that. And because they had privileged the European story, they ignored it. It was also learning to be able to read some of these texts for myself and see what the translations had missed out or smoothed over that was really helpful. And that's why, leading back to that professor's question from earlier, it's bringing those texts in, it's letting them speak the truth for themselves, and really always questioning and leading with a spirit of curiosity, and always sort of understanding what is maybe left out here that could be the most exciting part. And I've been so pleased about all the exciting things I've been able to find and to work with.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Could you please tell us a little bit more about that structure that's pictured on the slide?
Yes, so you are just on the precipice of a trench that contains a 3-story building carved out of the living rock. We are in Lalibela, Ethiopia, which is the northern part. And these churches were all carved between the 7th and 13th centuries or so. They initially probably had a military point. There's some of them, there's trenches like this, there's little bridges. And it's said in Ethiopian oral tradition, in these things called gadol, which are histories of saints, that Saint Ethiopia, who was a king, angels came to him in a dream to tell him to make these churches, and that they helped him to carve it. And we actually see paintings, illuminations of those angels helping him carve. We also know that these are absolute hydraulic engineering feats to prevent these from flooding. They're made of a kind of stone that is quite soft when it's carved, yet when it's exposed to oxygen, it hardens. These are all churches that are actively used. This photograph was taken, I believe, in 2015, and we chose it specifically for the introduction to the exhibition because it's quite dramatic. When I first opened the doors, when we just installed the wallpaper, I actually stopped short because I felt like I was going to fall down the trench into the bottom where the building is. But also because when you look closely, you get the pointer here, you can see that there's a man taking a photo with a smartphone. So showing in a very literal way, this is part of people's lives today. And it was a great way to bring home the idea of the relevance of these historical sites. In the past, this was considered a new Jerusalem after Jerusalem fell during the era of Crusades. And there's actually a river Jordanus, the river Jordan. There's a tomb of Golgotha. It's a kind of duplicate, this idea always that Ethiopians trace the faith to their land, to their people. And indeed, the kings of Ethiopia trace their lineage back to Solomon of Israel. So we see these connections between places. They're fascinating buildings. If you ever have the opportunity to go to them, absolutely go.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Well, I'm going to make my way as I walk down and talk. Thank you so much to Dr. Kristen Windmuller-Luna for being here. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yes, and thank you also to the Boshell Lecture Series on Archaeology, which helps bring wonderful scholars such as these to the DMA and make all of this possible. And thank you all for coming out, and I hope you'll check out our Level 3 Arts of Africa with new eyes. Thanks so much.